Chapter 6 The End of Science. Scientific knowledge is a mystery apart, and those who serve it constitute an isolated priesthood, who may not have traffic with the world and who have to guard the possession of the truth. In what manner the temporal and empirical present might find its way out of its dilemma, is a matter which it leaves on one side. It is not the immediate practical business and appurtenance of philosophy. F. W. Hegel. The individual has for a long time been unable to see the world of which he lives as a single whole. In order to have a universal picture, one would need today a whole lifetime's most strenuous work. That is why any pretensions to count oneself or anybody else as being educated are so unfounded. The individual at best dominates nowadays his limited professional area. Beyond that he possesses a few swimmy images of the world, but they are far too vague and indefinite for any stable picture to be built from them. Nonetheless, he has a priesthood to foster and confirm, a picture of the world, to which he can turn at any moment. In a world based upon human consciousness, science has assumed the role of the earlier priesthood, and represents today man's general and universal consciousness. So that if one wants to ascertain how things are with consciousness, one must turn to science and busy oneself with that. And in so doing one comes up against a phenomenon which can be remarked in the world of profane actuality. Science has to such an extent lost itself in detail and specialties, that it quite lacks any single clear outlook over the whole of things, any kind of universal unity. It is not possible to obtain from science today a clear, unambiguous answer to any question which can be put to it clearly and unambiguously from the sphere of profane reality. This is not merely due to the fact that science has created its so terms and translated reality into a kind of cipher message. That must be accepted, for in the final count every worker can demand the prerequisites of his craft. It is also due to the fact that science, split up as it is into the most diverse areas and disciplines, all of them further specialized in themselves, has no longer any dominant discipline to draw the results together and thus represent the unity of science. There simply does not exist, what man has for some time been so earnestly seeking, a book which can give an exhaustive answer to even one of his questions, or indicate that central information office from which he can get the answer. While this is the result of specializing, it points also to a more important lack in which the historical destiny of science reveals itself. The leveling down of the hierarchy is manifest in the sphere of science also. When modern man goes looking for the central information office which is to register all the attainments of science, and have an abundance of certified answers to hand, he reveals his anxiety. The layman of yesteryear may indeed have believed in the existence of such a central information office, but he never felt it necessary to visit it, partly because the questions did not press, but also because he had just such a center of certainty and assurance in himself, one which he could not well describe, but which was there simply because he believed in it. His belief in science was like his belief in his own consciousness, it was rooted in his feelings, and had religious traits. Once he had believed in God, without having seen Him. Now he believed in science, without having seen it. Merely the content of belief had changed. When he began doubting God, he demanded proofs of the existence of God. Having fallen into anguish and wretchedness, he now demands support for his faith in science. The case is more difficult. A proven God is no God at all. But proof is the only foundation for science. There ought, says man on his search for the central information office of science, there ought to be something like a supreme scientific authority, supervising everything, uniting everything in itself and having full information on everything and getting reports from the specialized branches of science when anything new has happened in their department, so that one can be thoroughly in the picture all the time, and know just how things are with the world and mankind. This is a perfectly justifiable demand. Man's consciousness is the only weapon he has in his fight for existence in a threatening and constraining world. It is therefore important that it should tell him at any moment how the world is disposed and how he should behave in it. Man needs a shell, or he dissolves and loses his shape. Science has taken over the task of providing this shell. It is the consciousness of our species, and therefore has a preeminent position. Turning to it today, however, man is threatened with profound disappointment. Science cannot give him the shell he seeks, for she herself is occupying it. What man is asking for and hunting for is authority, assured by the hierarchy of science, and authority and hierarchy exist as little in science as they do in our everyday world. But still there ought to be, the layman on the hunt might we object, something in the nature of a primal philosophy, a queen of the sciences, able to represent the whole, and include it as a unity. Otherwise science would be no more than a heap of potsherds. Science is just such a heap of potsherds. What the layman looking for existed for so long as authority and the hierarchy in science remained, and that has not been the case for some centuries now. For the supreme and primal philosophy, the queen of the sciences, was metaphysics. If the layman appealed there, he got what he vainly seeks today, an answer without becoming entangled in the labyrinth of separate sciences. Metaphysics, of course, was based upon God, which is the reason why it no longer exists. Science in the Western sense had as its forerunners a series of personalities who, living from the 6th century BC in the Greek colonies in Asia Minor, Lower Italy, and Thrace, cared to think independently about mythical or religious obligations, and to create themselves a natural explanation of the world and of life. Up to that time men's knowledge had lain in the hands of the priestly caste and was not separated from religion. The causes of the change, so important for the history of the world, are rooted in the nature of the Greek people, and in certain circumstantial matters. The weakness of Greek religion and the lack of an influential priestly caste were just as important in their effect as the merging of several individual states. The high culture of these states produced independent personalities who were liberated from man's universal and natural dependence, and freed from all other obligations, like those of profession and family. They mostly came from rich old families, but they had no national or political linkage with the hometown, and on long journeys had acquainted themselves with foreign peoples and foreign knowledge. The emergence of such personalities is possible only at the peak point of a culture, which has freed men from universal and natural dependence, thus relieving them of anguish, without having brought them back to dependence on those liberated social forces making for the decline of every culture, and ultimately bringing about its collapse. The possibility of freedom from all connections with state or religion, and of material independence, made secure by comparative wealth, supported the emergence of such personalities, although many of them had to fight social resistance, and some of them, indeed, fell victims to it. The emergence of what man in the West understands as science is not so much a question of an event taking place in the realm of the intellect, and arising, as it were, in a mutation of the human species, but of certain internal conditions and outer circumstances which permitted man for a brief period to assume a particular attitude of mind, known to us today as scientific. It consists in man making himself independent of internal and external obligations, and depending only on his gift for observation, his experience, his knowledge, and his thought, that is, relying in effect on his consciousness alone. Since this has been the characteristic attitude of Western science for some centuries, and since its intellectual and material effects have conquered the whole world, it seems absurd to question whether the attitude is possible or whether mankind can live with it. But the question gains a certain historical justification from the fact that the attitude lasted in Greece only a little time, and in the West it has been valid for only a few centuries, and is apparently bringing it to the great crisis of its history. Scientific thought reaches to the limits of human consciousness in every direction, no matter how far removed those limits be. When man begins thinking scientifically, he certainly extends the circle of the world around him by divesting it of mythical and religious conceptions and subjecting it to the power of his will. He thus experiences an increase in power and liberty, and this forms his being and gives it conformation. But the power cannot give him complete independence. Consciousness encompasses at any one time only a part of the surrounding world and the dark being which is man. Beyond that, secretiveness and dependence begin once more. Man can obliterate this limit by assuming that he can remove it entirely. But that is a belief only, and therefore a contradiction of the scientific attitude. Extrovert being that he is, man soon comes to terms with the outside world, and the settlement is based on his consciousness, which is indeed primarily a knowledge of the outside world. Only later does he perceive that something has occurred in him himself, that he has assumed a shape which is the internal result of the power and freedom he has won in the outside world. But even if his domination is extended far, and the shell in which he can enjoy his liberty and give his strength free play embraces the wide world, and if the resulting form of his own being should afford him much security and certainty, nonetheless there has been no removal of the frontier beyond which dependence and secrecy begin. For being conscious is never identical with the world's being and one's own being, it never quite contains that whole abundance of being, of others as well as his own, which man feels in his genuine experience, and which is delivered in immediate cognition to the spiritual force beyond his consciousness. Man can therefore never remove the barrier before him, and at times will be painfully reminded that he has been working with unknowns, which suddenly demonic and smash his form and shell, and his power and liberty with them. The intrusion may come from nature and the universe, the true being of which smashes up the ciphertexts into which his consciousness had transposed them. It can also happen from within, through the total of human being taking up arms against the straitjacket of culture into which man's conscious will seeks to cramp it. The high points of culture, where human beings seem to have become perfectly free and independent, have been quite rare to date. Brief transition periods followed by a speedy fall, when man enclosed by the shell of culture usually proves himself to be himself the great unknown. Upon the high point of ancient Greek culture few thinkers dared entirely to ignore the limits and adopt that attitude which today seems to us characteristic of scientific thought. Those who did so furnished ideas upon which modern science is building, foremost among them Democritus, the first to deny a soul to nature and the universe and interpret them as a mechanical play of atoms. Other thinkers broke with the mythical and religious conceptions of tradition, but did not on that account move towards atheism, as we should call it today. They pushed on through thought alone to monotheism, giving place, even were it only symbolically, to mythical and religious conceptions which endeavored to embrace the whole of the world and of humanity. The superior discipline of science, which brought it within a unitary picture embracing the whole, was metaphysics. Metaphysics was science in so far as it collated the certified results of the separate disciplines. The results served as material for metaphysics to create a world image, a thing individual sciences are neither in a position to sketch out nor interested in sketching out. In aggregating and interpreting the material to form a world image, metaphysics is philosophy. But it is more than that, for it supports itself not on the scientifically certified material of consciousness alone, but has to embrace also all that had its basis in man's aboriginal experience and bears the character of inward certainty. It accordingly takes up the mythical and religious elements of unconscious feelings and imagination, and includes these in its picture of the world. In that way it draws near to theology, and coalesces with it when theology is not stiff with dogmatism, but has its roots in vital religious experience. Metaphysics therefore bases its world image upon a power lying beyond all conscious experience, and properly regarded as the prime cause and final ground. Accordingly, metaphysics was reckoned the primal philosophy and queen of the sciences. It is described by Aristotle, who named it, as theology. So long as metaphysics was valid, the opposition between natural and scientific thought, which in our days is tearing man's life asunder, and ends by destroying every image of the world and of man, could not become so pronounced. Metaphysics kept the path above open, and gave man a visible, comprehensible image of the world by which to regulate himself, albeit the world image was involved in mythical and religious elements and bore an allegorical character. The God to whom it pointed, and who constituted the supreme principle of all sciences, was the same in whom nature man believed and to whom in immediate experience he was just as close as the peaks of science. Metaphysics thus not only guaranteed the unity of the sciences by setting them all under a common principle, but guaranteed the unity of man and of life. Once man has freed himself from immediate dependence on the outer world around him, and experienced its workings, and taken them into consciousness, mysteriousness or dependence is concentrated on the space above him. His deepest religious and mythical conceptions are drawn up to heaven, above him he perceives the mighty living opposite or counterpart, which looks upon him unchanged. The space of heaven therefore becomes the sphere of the divine, the seat of God himself, and genuine religious feeling is never to be separated from this upwards direction. Metaphysics, as the first philosophy to have sketched out an image of the world and at the same time to have maintained alert the immediate relationship with God, has therefore been specially involved with human preoccupation in heavenly space and the stars. Astronomy, occupied with those spheres to which religious experience is directed as the seat of God, stood next to, and was directly bound up with metaphysics. The linkage revealed itself at the emergence of Greek metaphysics in the 6th century BC. Metaphysical thought was kindled by the eternal and unchanging movement of the stars circling high above man in space, and displaying the highest perfection of orderliness and beauty. It created the idea of the cosmos, which became central in Greek metaphysical thought. The movements of the stars presupposed a prime mover to set them in action, and led to monotheism, to the figure of a god, whom Xenophanes and, after him, Anaxagoras were the first to correlate with universal reason. Aristotle's theology perfected this idea and sketched out a metaphysical world image which remained valid in the West for 2000 years. The round earth is situated in the center of world ball. The pure and indestructible area of the ether is dominated by that most perfect of motions, the circle. The planets revolve round the earth, and are fixed to transparent spheres which rotate on their axes. Around these rotates the outside sphere of the fixed stars. The motion is eternal and returns into itself. Prima mobile, God, is conceived as being tranquil and immobile, pure energy, as spirit and highest reason, counterpoise to the world. The God of Aristotle is abstract, colorless, utterly spiritualized. He is thought concerned with itself, the thought of thought, and as such has rationalistic and intellectual traits. It is a God residing in himself and thinking himself, neither desiring nor acting, the ideal of philosophers and ancient sages, and not based upon religious life and experience. It is the crowning of a world image which in its artistic beauty and rational imprint unites in itself the main features of the Greek nature. It continued unchanged even in a subsequent age, when Greek thought passed on to other questions of ethics and specialized scientific research, to end up in Neoplatonism with a mystical and religious content, and turn into theosophy. The important thing about this dominant direction of Greek philosophy is that it alone on the whole journey of thought led to the supposition of a supreme principle and first basis, and thus led to monotheism, albeit the figure of deity was intellectualized. It formed the foundation of metaphysics. Corresponding to the abstract image of God, intellectual speculation predominates there, too, yet the mysteriousness and dependence conformable to the nature of man remain. The sensible purposiveness of the universe leads thought on to the supposition of a prime mover, and thus adheres to the religious elements of men's nature. Measured by the modern viewpoint of Western man, this direction must be regarded as unscientific, since modern scientific thought has taken another direction of Greek speculation, whose most outstanding representative was Democritus. Democritus, together with his compatriot Protagoras, was the most important representative of the sophists. To use his own words, he sought in the fullness of understanding the one thing it is worth struggling to attain. In him human consciousness asserts itself as absolute, identifies itself with being, and liberates mankind from mystery and dependence. That being so, he had to demonstrate a world adapted to consciousness, devoid of all mythical religious and psychical forces, and susceptible of being mastered by man. To sketch such an image, conditions permitting man to liberate himself entirely from any link with nature and the universe, and to regard them as dead objects, are necessary. Such an attitude of mind presupposes a high level of assured civilization. The attitude of Democritus is therefore not to be severed from his personal world. He lived in the flourishing commercial town of Abdera, in Thrace. Urban life separating man from nature affords him security and confirms his self-consciousness. Ultimately it is nothing but aggregated power. The power results from many generations and numberless individuals who have dared to take action against nature and to tear away part of its mystery. Anyone setting himself in full enjoyment of this power experiences a confirmation of his own self-sufficiency, which deceitfully lowers him beyond the limits set to his nature. Democritus came from a well-known family, he belonged to the elite. Wealthy and independent, he traveled widely, and returned to his hometown to lead the life of a rich independent gentleman, free to devote himself to intellectual pursuits. For a man to be able to adopt such an attitude, conditions of very wide scope have first to be fulfilled. He must be in possession of the capital of civilization heaped up by preceding generations, at a time before social forces have begun to dispute it. This is a brief transitional stage in the history of cultures, quite apart from the fact that up-to-date scientific epochs have been rare and quickly over. The man must feel completely independent of nature and the universe in order to adopt a perfectly cool and distant attitude towards them. He must not experience natural creation in its living amplitude, but regard it as material in order to fit and subordinate it to mathematics. The necessary preconditions of pure rationalism are always the same. Human consciousness relying on itself alone can only maintain itself in a material and mechanized world, because it is only in such a world that the mathematical technique can be employed. And only upon that technique can human consciousness base itself. Democritus shattered the universe into innumerable corpuscles, not perceptible, not further divisible, and by him named atoms. These atoms are imperishable and have mass. They are the tiny bricks whence nature and the universe are composed, without any sensual quality, structures therefore which submit without difficulty to the technique of mathematics. For these small corpuscles to move and fall and collide and rebound, space must be empty. Thus there only exist atoms and empty space, or, as Democritus himself put it, in truth there are atoms and the void. Universe and nature have been divested of their mystery by their quality being denied. Everything is movement of atoms in empty space, every activity is referred back to the contact and pressure and weight of small bodies which possess no qualities beyond thickness and hardness and weight, and thus constitute nothing save quantity. Their movement occurs under conditions of strict necessity. Chance is ruled out, and the incidence of deity is quite impossible. This world image has nothing to do with the living being of nature and the universe as given to man in his inner experience, but being and being conscious both conceal themselves in it. Man is now confronted with a dead, material, mechanized universe, from which mystery and dependence have been removed. But it is a universe he can dominate mathematically, and in which therefore he can base himself upon his consciousness alone. The materialism and mechanism of Democritus, which had their roots in the rationalism and intellectualism of Protagoras and the Sophists, was a brief episode in the Greek world, exercising no lasting influence. It has become important only now that Western thought is copying it, and, in an historically similar situation, is making it a basis for its thought and its power. Throughout the history of Western thought, Aristotle's picture of the universe, moved by the supreme wisdom of Godhead, has been dominant. 3. In the religion of Jewry man had not been put into nature, but into history. He lived in the hope of salvation through the appearance of the Messiah and the realization of the kingdom of Israel upon earth. In the figure of Yahweh he had the one ruler God, creator of heaven and earth, who had lifted the creation up from nothing, or chaos, and stood before an opposite mankind as a well-intentioned and active God, guiding and punishing. Man, being made in the image of God, was Lord of nature, not dependent on her nor subject to her, but having a direct creaturely relationship to the one living God enthroned above him. In Christendom this God revealed himself in the flesh and form of a servant, thus fulfilling the historic process which had been promised by God through his prophets. But the expectation which served as the first real foundation of the historical process is not thereby removed, but increased. Christ's return, the last judgment, and the resurrection of the dead are to bring an end to all history. Man, to whom the Christian event was manifest, had no need to dwell on the sensible and orderly purposiveness of the universe. The new religious experience afforded him other foundations. He based his thought upon the self-certainty of inner experience, classically formulated by St. Augustine, and viewed his life within a predetermined historical course which was hastening to its end. In the enthusiasm of his pristine experience, he saw only this approaching end of history, to which he related events of the world around him or in nature. Christianity created Western man's image of the world, and set it not in space, but in time and history. But once the original enthusiasm and belief in the Savior's advent had subsided, Christian thought lacked the power to create out of immediate religious experience a philosophy of its own. It was influenced by a complicated interplay of Greek philosophy and Jewish religion as forces with which it had to come to terms. It took up elements of Jewish apocalypse and eschatology, and somewhat of the Greek intellectualism and rationalism. Neither of these elements corresponds to Christ's teaching, but they served a Christianity which had to create for itself a foundation in dogma. Internal driving force and external structure were then sufficient to make its existence secure, and the strangeness of the two elements did not appear so long as Christian faith maintained its strength and kept its proselytizing power. Neoplatonism, which had transformed Greek thought into theology, enabled Christianity to appropriate Greek ideas. It dominated the philosophy of the Church Fathers, based on religious living and inner experience, and found its finest expression in the world image of St. Augustine, which remained typical of Western thought for over 1,000 years. Aristotle's influence grew stronger in the development of medieval theology. His universal world image reached the West in the conceptions of Ptolemaeus, and was taken over together with the astronomical doctrines of Ptolemaeus. Aristotle's picture of the world needed but minor changes to suit Christian conceptions. It was only necessary to put God the Father in place of the prime mover to have a spatial image adequate to the Christian historical image. The historic relationship between God and man, dependent on revelation and inner experience, obtained in this way its spatial foundation, corresponding directly to immediate vision and natural feeling. Space and time, nature and history constituted the basic pillars of the world image of the medieval West, one of sublime unity and self-sufficiency, directly influencing our life and thought to this day. Built as it were a pyramid, a structure in which every phenomena had its place, it was an order established by God the Father, who sat enthroned above the apex of the pyramid and dominated nature and history alike, now as a God desiring and acting, punishing and judging, now as a spirit tranquil in himself and based on his thoughts of thought. In this world one scheme of thought embraced the whole. Theology had become the queen of the sciences. The unity and self-sufficiency of the world image were, however, the causes of its collapse. Christianity bore the imprint of a late epoch of civilization. Man had lost his universal and natural links, and was yearning for redemption. The great Pan was dead and the flesh of man had become sinful. The Jewish religion in its historical framework had no need of natural and universal links, and Greek speculation knew only the sensible purposiveness and orderliness of the universe, set in motion by a prime mover with intellectualistic and rationalistic traits. Both concepts reflect the attitude of late and ripe civilizations, and in this formulation Christianity was given to youthful peoples who maintained a close connection with nature and the universe. They received traditional Christianity at the beginning of their cultural development, with its ascetic imprint corresponding to the final stages of ripe and late cultures, united to a total world image served by an admirable organization and not lacking means of compulsion. Every kind of asceticism, voluntary or involuntary, releases in man forces which pile up and sooner or later break out. The stronger and more primal these forces are, the more demonic they are in their ultimate emergence. Ascetic education carried out through an anti-natural nature taming form of Christianity has become of world historic importance. It was the source of Western technical power, which dominates the world today. The destruction of the medieval conception of the world ensued when the natural forces of youthful peoples, tight-laced in asceticism, broke out and turned again towards nature and the universe. They no longer did so, however, in fear and trembling, feeling dependence and mystery, nor in complete surrender, but in an attitude corresponding to the change in their aboriginal powers wrought by ascetic education, that is to say, with an intellectual claim to dominate nature, in which Jewish and Greek elements were united. The flooding through of these natural forces, suppressed, stored up, and transformed by Christian asceticism, was bound to lead to a powerful revaluation of this world. What it did was to turn back Western man's energies, directed to the world beyond, to the world. Temporal and spatial, thereby introducing the most violent revolution which ever took place in the history of mankind. This diversion back from the far spiritual to things material constitutes the essential phenomenon of revolution. Anything else called revolution is only the result of this first change. This switch first appeared in the historic visions of Abbot Joachim of Flora, who lived in the 12th century and founded a philosophy of history which posited the realm of the spirit in an immediate future here below, thereby reversing all St. Augustine's metaphysics of history, directed as it was on the next world, spatially. The reversal first occurred with Nicholas Gesenius, in the 15th century. It was in the Italian Renaissance that the epoch-making nature of the event was revealed, introducing the modern Europe, which came to an end in 1914, and led into the crisis whose historic character is not yet known. It is important to compare the small Italian city-states of the Renaissance with the Greek city-states of the 5th century BC. They resembled each other almost to the extent of being interchangeable. And their citizens, though separated by 2 millennia, are similar. In Rome or Florence, the personal life of Renaissance man was like that of the citizen of Miletus or Athens. He had become just as independent of nature and the universe. But the material knowledge handed down to him was clearer and surer than the Greeks could collect from Egypt and the Orient, and the internal energies motivating him were more potent and demonic, having been bottled up by 1500 years of Christian asceticism. These energies were not turned to the realm of nature. At the beginning of modern Europe, the nature philosophy which had served Greek thought still held. But a change was coming. It is a mystery of human nature that what occurs in its depths assumes universal significance. Immanence and transcendence are just as interrelated as the opposite poles in an electrical field. Only when inner experience has found its universal expression does it become an event in the intellectual realm. In the visions of Joachim of Flora, and in the ideas of Nicholas of Cusa, what had happened to Western man was beginning to appear, but it only glistened obscurely, and had as yet no concrete form. The event in heaven was still lacking. It took place when Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo replaced the Aristotelian world image handed down through Ptolemaeus with the new Copernican picture, and thus returned to the attitude and ide of Democritus. Space is empty and infinite. The earth is not the center of the universe, but revolves round the sun. The stars move in accordance with eternal immutable laws, determined by the action and reaction, the attraction and repulsion of bodies. The world is a gigantic mechanical structure, functioning by reason of inherent compulsion. It is subject to the mathematical method, through which human consciousness can obtain an insight into the laws, and thus indirectly gain control of them. In all its essentials it is the teaching of Democritus which becomes the foundation for modern Europe's scientific thought, and upon this Western man has been living for 300 years. The world image serves as basis for the European Revolution, the very phrase appearing for the first time if Copernicus de revolutionibus orbium coelestium. When a new event has been completed in heaven, the values and forms belonging to an outmoded world image are utterly broken up and destroyed. The metaphysic of Aristotle had remained in force, made secure through its connection with astronomy. Christian theology had been narrowly linked with it in medieval philosophy, through the Ptolemaic world image, and by direct appropriations from Aristotle himself. The new world image was therefore bound to lead to a shattering convulsion of the Church, and, passing beyond it, of the Christian religion, and even of belief in God, since a God possessed of volition and activity, who judged and rewarded, was within this mechanism no longer possible. God himself was bound to the brazen laws of the universe and deprived of his liberty. Space had become really void now, emptied of God, who had been limited to the intellectual image of a prime mover. Then lost in absolute space and deprived of his personality, till finally he entirely vanished, because, in Laplace's words, he was no longer needed as an hypothesis. This new world image, the foundations of which were securely laid in the 18th century, was supported on two main pillars. First, on mechanistic natural science, which, with the aid of mathematics, had swiftly shot forwards from discovery to discovery and seemed about to reveal the world's last secret. Second, on history, which now appeared as an independent power and set itself beside science as a peer. The role of history in thought is often ignored. People are not aware of its religious and mythical elements so long as they are dominated and upheld by them. Modern European history is peculiarly religious. The religious enthusiasm of Christianity continued in it, but the goal of history was displaced from beyond to this plane, thus making a material future alone valid for mankind. Then Jewish material messianism, taken over by Christianity but freed now of its Christian fetters, made its influence felt. All the eschatological and chiliastic elements of Christianity and Judaism, limited to a future in this material world, began to show their full force after natural science had voided space and made the upward path quite meaningless. They afforded the concepts of development and progress by which modern Europe has been determined. Progress became one of the elemental terms of history, and gave it that driving force into the future which, consciously or otherwise, had a chiliastic goal. Development was a diversion of this tendency to natural science, to which it thereby communicated a similar impetus, thus effecting a union between natural science and history by which man enveloped from both sides, nature and history was seized and torn forwards. If astronomy was the strongest prop of Aristotelian metaphysics, modern natural science was the strongest prop of this history metaphysics, the mythical and religious background of which was obscured. Through its discoveries, natural science provided the miracles of faith. The Copernican world image alone, with its empty unending space, could not have moved men to surrender the world image in which they had lived for thousands of years. Other means were needed for that. They appeared when natural science displayed the wonders of the engine. It was only then that the old world image really collapsed, and with it the belief in a God living in heaven and deciding the destinies of mankind, and only in that instant did the concept's development and progress become forces which grabbed the masses and hurled them into the future. Science and history bore the modern world image quite alone. Other aspects of thought were dependent upon them, and could maintain themselves only so far as they succeeded in clinging on to them. Particularly is that true of modern European philosophy. The materialism and mechanism of natural scientific thought were bound to produce an appendage of rationalism and intellectualism, they making man dependent on consciousness alone and excluding mystery and dependence. Man, being based by the mathematical method on his consciousness alone, needed an additional philosophic foundation, and obtained it in the 17th century from Descartes, who transmuted the inner religious experience upon which St. Augustine had based his thought into the self-certainty of thought. His famous slogan, Cogito ergo sum, corresponds in its significance to Protagoras' thesis that man is the measure of all things. Modern European philosophy has since then been nothing but a consciousness philosophy, and has endeavored to get from being conscious to being. 4. This summary glance at the intellectual historical development of Western men was necessary if we are to understand why science has no central information office capable of answering the question which torture men. The demolition of the scientific hierarchy corresponds to the descent to the level of modern European man with all his values. It displays this general procedure in a sector, that of thought and speculation, which has been regarded as the one central area of life, bearing in mind that the two great pillars of the modern world image are natural science and history, upon which all modern, though depends, it will be sufficient to sketch the development and collapse of these two, passing over their dependence. We have barely left the modern epoch, and suffer from an incomprehensible mass of names, ideas, and theories. It is too early to judge how much substance there is in the thought, and how much of this rationalistic speculation will prove to be mere froth, but it already appears as though the real substance of Western thought lies much farther back. A mighty hero cult has flourished alongside the modern priesthood of science, and even today a cloud of incense seems to hover over every university chair, conferring grace upon its each incumbent, but it looks as though many of the church fathers had more stuff in them than a dozen modern professors. Be that as it may, the far-famed modern spirit has gone swiftly up the ramp of the hierarchy between the two main pillars of natural science and history, and as the pillars have begun to collapse, it, too, has begun to sag, and it is not yet clear how much will stand. Until the 16th century, theology remained at the apex of the hierarchy. After the new natural science had destroyed its world image and volatilized God into an hypothesis, the descent to the level began, or as Nietzsche called it, the breakup of the great medieval ice pack. We are still, he writes, amidst the breakup of the medieval ice pack. The thought has come and caused a vast and devastating movement. Berg towers over berg, all the banks are flooded and in peril. The revolution simply cannot be avoided, and it is an atomistic revolution, but what are the smallest indivisible particles of human society? The descent proceeds as already portrayed on the stepped ramp of society. If the top step collapses, after having set itself up as absolute and autonomous, the next highest step replaces it and sets itself up as absolute and autonomous, only to collapse in its turn, and so on, till the level is reached. When 16th century theology lost its place as supreme knowledge, 17th century metaphysics took its place, and an attempt was made to recreate and set up on a natural foundation that unity of life and thought, of being and being conscious, which had hitherto been based on religion and made secure by theology. Man's consciousness, isolated by the materialism and mechanism of natural science, and liberated from mystery and dependence, seated itself on the throne of God and declared itself the supreme principle. It made scientific, mathematical, and astronomical perceptions the basis of a philosophical system, that is to say, of a new finite world image, upon which it based itself. The 17th century was the age of metaphysics and great systems, the flower and peak of European rationalism. It displayed an astonishing wealth of thinkers: Suarez and Bacon, Galileo, Kepler, Descartes, Hobbes, Spinoza, Pascal, Leibniz, and Newton. These became the fathers of modernity, and continued as such until yesterday insofar as the faith in human consciousness was based upon them, and still remain such today, when man, in his wretchedness and insecurity, takes his questions to science. This great epoch of European metaphysics ended fruitlessly, without giving rise to a representative system, and led to the next highest step in the 18th century, when the philosophy of enlightenment, like the Greek sophists, popularized and vulgarized the idea of the autonomy of consciousness, brought it down to the broader layers of the bourgeoisie, and linked it up with the reality of literary, social, and political interests. The next highest step is ever more thickly populated than its predecessor and evinces a lower intellectual level. At the beginning of philosophical enlightenment stood the English, at its end the French Revolution. The 19th century brought the next step in the scientific hierarchy to domination, that of economics and sociology, influenced by the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution in England. It found its greatest theoretician in Comte with positivism, and was popularized and politicized in the historical materialism of Marx. As we have only just left this gradation, it may be helpful to treat of it in fuller detail. Comte was the first thinker to see the dissolution of the hierarchy and he takes it as his standpoint, by making it absolute and setting up his law of three stages, according to which human perception has first to pass through the theological stage, then the metaphysical, and finally the positive stage, which it had reached in him. The idea as such had already been grasped in ancient days and carried to its conclusion, by for example Polybius, and it appears in modern times in the conceptions of history of Machiavelli and later of Vico. Up to then it had been regarded under the image of a circular movement. The linear historical concept of progress as of an arrow aimed into the future gave it, in Comte's theory, an immediate relationship with the present, and therefore political character, which was intensified in Marx's historical materialism to a pure messianism. It was with Comte that the historical process of the leveling down and removal of the hierarchy in science became conscious for th. first time, and thus an object of human contemplation. The boss of positivism was an historical construction leading to and justifying the process, while seeking also to demonstrate within the social reality the working of the same brazen and immutable laws that had been set up by natural science. These are the two basic tendencies upon which economics and sociology have been living ever since. Positivism rested, of course, on the presumption that man is to be treated as a corpuscle or atom, a soulless bit of matter, and that the social reality must be regarded as a gigantic mechanism because the mathematical method can work only in terms of quantity. It was on this presumption that Comte foundered, he being motivated by religious and mystical ideas. The mechanical conclusion was really reached by Marxian materialism, which at the same time turned the historical foundation into immediate messianism. The economic sociological stage of science, which dominated the 19th century and was supported by the real forces of society, constituted the last step of the scientific hierarchy before reaching the level. As economics, it became the science of the third estate, seeking with its help to establish capitalism. As sociology, it became the science of the fourth estate, seeking with its help to establish socialism. The social-political split runs right through the middle of it. This gives it its iridescent and fluid character, which defies any unequivocal fixation. Its method is, however, both in the capitalist and the socialistic directions, one and the same. It clamps itself closely onto natural science and history, and endeavors to make the essence of both serve its purpose, employing the mathematical method on the one side, and the taking over of historical messianism and its drive to the 1,000-year empire on the other. If this economic social stage of thought concentrated more and more upon the fourth estate, it was due, among other things, to the capitalism of the third estate having allied itself with the rationalism and intellectualism of the preceding stages and losing its power of attraction, whereas the socialism of the fourth estate had, in addition to the elements of natural science and history, and anthropology of its own. In the figure of the worker it possessed the new man who had been created by industrialism and at the same time violated and despoiled by capitalism, who bore the character of a martyr, and consequently had no further need to prove himself a man. This anthropology propped itself up on a myth, in the same way that the economics and sociology of the 19th century were beginning to load themselves up more and more with mythical components and were leaving the ground of science. It was in the Russian Revolution that sociology created its reality, which, based upon the ideas of the 19th century, is breaking down in the 20th. It is breaking down through the overthrow of natural science and the extinction of historical messianism, but above all, because the mythical anthropology of socialism is breaking down. The crisis of the transition period has created so many martyrs that the worker type can no longer apply the argument to himself alone. It is in anthropology that science has really reached the level. The path from God to man finds its mirror image in the path from theology to anthropology. Anthropology is the science of the 20th century. Its forerunners were already visible in the 19th century, for example, in a thinker like Feuerbach, who said of himself what could be said of the whole of modern development. My first thought was God, my second reason, my third end. Last is man. Far more significant and effective for the new thought is Kierkegaard, who was satisfied with establishing the state of desperation into which man has got, and exercises a decisive influence. Today, speaking broadly, there are four great stages in the decline of science in modern times, from the theology of the 16th century over the metaphysics of the 17th, and the philosophy of the 18th, to the economics and sociology of the 19th. Until finally, in the 20th, we have reached the level, and the whole of the hierarchy has broken down above man, who, having lost hope in anthropology, is now beginning to ask who he is and to what end he is alive. It is the peculiarity of the process that the framework of the hierarchy remains, albeit denuded of its importance. Even today, theology is still taught in the pulpit, with or without Aristotle. Metaphysics, too, have not been quite extinguished. There are enough chairs of philosophy, and the economics and sociology lecture rooms are crowded. But such things are no longer representative of our times. Just as religion, and theology with it, became private matters, so capitalism and socialism are losing their compulsive force, their representative significance, their power of attraction. They are turning into technical methods of scientific and social life, only to be regarded under the sign of usefulness and practical efficiency. Robbed of the superstructure of their fictive legality, as also of their messianic content, they are sinking down to a neutral realm of practice and exercise. Sociology, which drew its vitality from the destruction of social theories and spoke contemptuously of ideologies, is now itself disintegrating, because it was unable to create an anthropology of its own. So long as these two main pillars of the European world image, natural science and history, remained unaffected, the movement around them was of secondary importance. When these pillars themselves crashed at the beginning of the 20th century, modern man's world image collapsed, and modern Europe ended with them. We are today in a world of which we possess neither a spatial nor an historic image. We are in a no man's land, in nothingness, in chaos, and are well aware of the fact. Awareness of nothingness is the state of desperation, and desperation knows only the way of yea or nay, the way to God or the way to the devil. That is our situation. But before pursuing it further, let us look a little more closely at the extinction of history and the collapse inside natural science, those two decisive events of the modern era. 5. The messianic faith of Western men is fading out today, and as it grows weaker, he can study it more curiously. For he has been far from clear about the nature of the spiritual forces from which he has been drawing his life. There is an important literature of Christian faith, the development of the Church and the emergence of its dogmata, but little has been written on the peculiar eschatological material, the very soil whereon all else was first built up. There is similarly an important literature on the history of modern times, the development of culture, and the emergence of civilization, while on the peculiar eschatological force of the belief in progress and development, from which alone all this emerged, practically nothing has been written. Eschatology has been the ground of both medieval and modern man, but we have become conscious of it only as it has yielded beneath us and collapsed. Western eschatology has been the sole work of that potent historical phenomenon, the Jewish prophets. They are unique, and are not to be explained by historical predecessors, like the Parsees, for their teaching is pure history, free of all cosmic speculation. Here is made plain the alliance between the tribal God Yahweh and his people alone in history, before which all else becomes indifferent, and from practical prophecy this God becomes the Creator of the world, Lord of all peoples, and leader of world destiny, to whom all peoples are subject. Through the bond between God and the people, every external event will be related to the plan of redemption, upon which God and the people are engaged, and which was announced through the mouths of the prophets. It is in the words and visions of the prophets that God has hitherto revealed himself most clearly in the history of mankind. Holiness breaks from them directly and potently over man. It has been the world historical destiny of the Jewish people to have this revelation fulfilled and perfected in Jesus Christ, and it is their world historical tragedy to have linked up Messianism with immediate expectations. In this material realm, after having given the world the only monotheism not gained from science and thought, the reality of the living God in the figure of our Savior, had the Jewish people been able to follow their prophets along the path which led to the appearance of Jesus of Nazareth, there would have been no Jewish problem. But Jewry, as a chosen people, would have been dissolved among humanity and turned into a myth. The Jewish people made a linkage with God. They passed through deep suffering, but they knew a day of judgment was coming, and the kingdom of God and the dominance of Israel were to begin with the Messiah's appearance. History draws its dynamic force solely from religious energies, which luxuriate on the pregnant soil of eschatology and apocalypse. The appearance of the Christ had no influence on Jewish messianism, an expectation of salvation, except to increase and concentrate them as Christian communities formed. These communities, however, also took over the eschatology, the chiliasm, and the apocalyptic doctrine. The Savior had appeared in the form of a humble person and been crucified. He had risen from the dead, ascended to heaven, sitting on the right hand of God, from whence he should come to judge the quick and the dead. The second advent of the Christ, the last judgment, the resurrection of the dead, and the kingdom of God had been promised. Christ constituted the middle of history, the end being yet to come. Eschatological is one of the concepts of Christianity. Another Sid has concentrated more on what might be termed the human aspect of salvation, the forgiveness of sins, faith, the fulfillment of our Savior's commands, as most forcibly expressed in the Sermon on the Mount, immortality, and the eternal life awaiting each man after death. These two elements are indissolubly bound up with each other in Christianity, but the main weight of faith may rest now on the first appearing of the Savior, now on the eminently expected Second Advent, now on the personal counterpart or opposite, now on the historical future tense. The dual concepts of Christianity, writes Harnack, dominate the whole evangelical story down to present days. Eschatological considerations are strongly suppressed, but keep breaking through and continue to protect spiritual values against the worldlings by whom they are threatened. But the very fact that these two concepts are capable of being adapted to each other until in complete harmony, while on the other hand it is possible to make them quite antithetical, has complicated to an extraordinary extent the history of their dogmatic development. The antithesis arises because from the former concept, which in some way or other admits the fact of salvation as a present-day possession, one can postulate as an ultimate consequence a life eternal in the sense of immortality, but not an earthly kingdom of glory on the part of Christ, whereas, on the contrary, this eschatological concept must have for its consequence the devaluation of any property one may possess. In the present conditions of life, the first centuries of Christian development display a general slackening of enthusiasm and of the eschatological element. Christian dogmatics arise from the spiritual and not from the eschatological way of looking at things. It was Greek thought which, by its static attitude and its universal tradition, cut across Jewish Messianism and, in particular in the works of the Greek Church Fathers, strengthened two phenomena which have set the form of Eastern Christendom, the meditative mysticism of the monk and the inclusion of nature in the Transfiguration and the Resurrection. And these have maintained themselves to this day in Russian Christendom in the form of the Startsi and the Easter festival. Mysticism and monasticism have kept their place in Christendom through the Greek element. They are the diametrical opposite to eschatology, to messianism, to chiliasm, and apocalyptic doctrine, because they aim at direct sympathetic participation in God, the Unio Mystica, and the Frutio Dei. It is from the interlocking and interplay and interstrife of these two elements that the history of Christianity has been determined until this day, and in modern Europe the religious forces stored up through mysticism have led straight to a messianism which was completely translated into worldly terms, and looked to find salvation in the material world. This was due to Western Christendom being permeated with eschatology to a far greater extent than Eastern Christendom. Christianity in the East, a refuge from the world, identified with the Christian state, void of history, and limited to cults and asceticism, has been devastated, but would appear to have retained a purer and stronger religious faith, which has a great task reserved for it. The reasons for the greater influence of eschatology in Western Christianity are numerous. They are to be sought in the Romish attitude of will power and dominance, inherited in the fixed edifice of theocracy, and in ecclesiastical orthodoxy, the former founded by Saint Augustine, the latter by Tertullian, and in the character of the peoples to whom the Christian message was brought, while the countries of the morning, in the East, placed the God-man and deification as the central point of their thought. The evening hour. Western God retained the stern Old Testament features of the judge, who maintains the law and tests men's works. The former tends in the apocalyptic direction, the latter in the chiliastic. The former looks to the end of all history and the last judgment, the latter to the 1,000 years realm of messianism. The prophetic contention of history running towards a fixed aim, a consummation, was in Christianity linked with certain abstract and already purely historical ideas, and led to a doctrine of historical ages. Two conceptions were linked up in the writing of the Fathers of the Church, like Eusebius and Hieronymus, that of the 4 realms of the world, and that of the 6 sages of the world. 4 world empires, Assyria, Persia, Macedonia, and Rome, had to come before the end of history was reached, or 6 world ages must follow each other down to the end of history. No doubt existed, but that the world was in the 4th world empire and the 6th world age, and that the end was near. This idea was the very foundation of Western Christianity, and gave it an intensity directed to the end, and as it were rushing into the future, now into fear and trembling before the last judgment, now towards the consolation of the 1,000 years realm, from apocalypse to messianism and on to chiliasm and back again. It is the peculiarity of Western mankind to be conditioned, not by the past or the present, but by the future. And the future alternates between the catastrophe, world's end, and the glory of the realm to come and the new life. Thus emerges a human being who is pressed up and down in th destiny room of history, and is drawn on as by a magnet towards things to come. These basic elements of Western man rest upon strong and mythical forces in the depth of his being, eluding conscious apprehension, and for that very reason possessing mysterious effectiveness. They make a final breach with that unhistoried existence of men in nature, which developed into a vicious circle in Indian, Greek, and also German thought. They place man in the midst of unique and directed events, having a beginning and an end, and give him an intensity which makes of him a new human type. But in waiting for what is to come, 2 different attitudes towards history are formed, according to the source and direction whence what is to come is expected. These 2 attitudes can be conveniently distinguished as the flat surface attitude and the line attitude. In the flat surface attitude, man waits for coming things to break in from above, They strike him vertically out of space, in respect of which time is a matter of indifference, being restrained by pressure of eternity bearing down upon it. This is the attitude of immediate religious life and mystical rapture, where time becomes dissolved. Since this attitude depends on the experience of the individual soul, it is seldom to be found in an historical collective form. It dominated Christianity in the earliest times, it provided the basis for St. Augustine's works, and it is, of course, the attitude of the mystic. For a great historian of the 19th century to recognize it, is a sign that he is himself directly moved by religion. Every epoch, Cedrenka, contacts God directly. In the line attitude, space and eternity retire into the background, and the vertical vanishes. Expectation no longer looks upwards, but forward. What is awaited comes upon man from ahead, or he is driven to meet it. This linear attitude towards history always presupposes an abatement of immediate religious experience and of the mystical rapture. Time, no longer restrained by eternity, appears as an independent autonomous power, and man views it in the image of a stream hastening towards its end, by which he himself is borne on. The linear attitude does not characterize the religious, but the conscious man, who has set himself in time, locked off from space and the soul, for time is the directed motion of conscious life. So long as man is strained vertically in immediate religious rapture, his expectation directed upwards, history will become for him a process which begins with God and has to end up with God. History in the material world derives significance only from its beginning in the non-material world and its approaching end there. It therefore becomes relative. Such is the conception of history of the earliest Christians, of the Church Fathers, of the God-state of St. Augustine, and of the whole of the Middle Ages. Faced with this attitude, Chiliasm loses its special grace and force. Pristine Christianity was able to seize upon the whole religious substance of the prophets, including the eschatological and apocalyptic elements, without falling into Chiliasm. Its attitude was that of the plain surface. Religious enthusiasm was strained vertically, and that which was to come would break in from above, and not from in front. Time had been dismissed by eternity, not as an abstract concept, but as reality for those in communion with it. When this immediate religious rapture declines, expectation slowly moves from above forwards, and the plane surface narrows, on which man stands, and forms into a line and becomes a directed flow. The process can be represented by a large indicator pointing vertically upwards, and then bending forwards on its fixed axis and pointing into the distance. Time, which is one of the categories of space, then replaces eternity. And this is the moment when history loses its relative significance, grows absolute, and turns into an autonomous power. Chiliasm and Messianism exert their full dynamic force. Western man, historically determined by Christianity, lives then in expectation of what is to come. He may expect it from above or from ahead, and can await it optimistically as the kingdom of God and the 1,000 years of peace, or pessimistically as the last judgment and destruction. Each historical epoch displays these attitudes opposed and multifariously contrasted. But every epoch is conditioned by a collective representative attitude, which gives it its especial character. The Middle Ages stand under the sign of the vertical, to which the cathedrals bear witness. Medievalism is pessimistic, dominated by the expectation of the end of the world and the judgment, with all its horrors. Its eschatology is apocalyptic, while the gay message of the coming kingdom of God recedes into the background. The church dominant of the law, soon getting into conflict with Caesar, and struggling for absolute theocracy and papal czarism, stood nearer to the judging and punishing God of the Last Judgment. The mystical enthusiasm of monasticism persisted beside this gloom. but it was to have the religious streams it released turned to temporal power by the Church, and, ultimately, it increased the Caesarism o vertical bar. The popes. Because Church organization established its claim to dominance, every kind of asceticism turned to power rather than to spirit. Yet apocalyptic expectation in the Middle Ages was already showing indications of the line attitude. A date fixed for the end o' the world must be revised, and from AD 1000 new dates were repeatedly given. Even Luther believed the world would end in 1560. Here religious expectation is being transferred from height to distance, from above forwards, with a weakening of eternity and an uprating of time. These prophesyings find soil already prepared, loosened by harsh circumstance, and they lead to great movements of repentance and flagellation in Italy about the middle of the 13th century, in Germany after the Black Death and around the mid-14th century. But these movements did not renew the religious substance, but ended in deception, deflation, and a material view of life. Into the expectation pretended towards world's end, the abbot Joachim of Flora suddenly brings a new chiliastic element, which had been troubling men's spirits from the 13th century, and, with a mighty tug, as it were, tears down the white curtain labeled World's End long awaited, and reveals behind it a third realm of blessed peace and liberation from all troubles and pains in the future. We cannot overvalue the effects of this monk, for his writings contain the essence of the ideas and movements which were to fill the next 700 years, however widely they differed in vesture and aim. The visions of Joachim of Flora contain fantastications, but genuine historical revelations also. It is as though in him past and future millennia were concentrated into a living present. The linear historic thought of modern Europe has given little heed to him, for his supereminent figure can be appreciated only by a conception of history which is related to the vertical, and knows that the past is not dead and gone, but stored deep in the human soul. The individual must sink down deep within himself to bring the past millennia into the present, when not only the past but also the future is illuminated also. It is because this kind of inner abstraction has gone out of fashion in modern historic thought that we have no more revelations and visions, but only annual statistics and dry facts which we dispose around us like a chaotic rubbish heap. In the writing of Joachim of Flora the substance of the old Chilias suddenly erupts from the Western soul, displaying all the Jewish and Christian elements, world doctrines, Kabbalistical numerology, mysticism, Sabellian, and Montanist ideas, which Chiliasm has assumed. But all of them now seem formed and modified to an historical picture which displays itself directly to our Calabrian abbot. The determinative elements of the picture comprise a turning from the mystical beyond to the materialist here and now, from the vertical to the horizontal, from height to distance, all of them making history an autonomous power hurrying away in unitary flow, and related to the future. Joachim divides history into three great epochs: that of the Father, from Adam to the Christ; that of the Son, lasting from the Christ to himself in the year 1260, and that of the Holy Ghost, going on till the end of the world, and manifesting within it the 1,000 years realm. The apocalyptic and distant pessimism of the Middle Ages switches round to that chiliastic immediate and practical optimism which has created the dynamics of modern Europe. The scheme introduces Christian faith in practical worldly terms, and confers on history that autonomous religious significance which possessed it until yesterday. Christ no longer means the end of mundane history, for the age of the Son is to be followed by the new third age, of the Holy Ghost. The age of the Father originated in the Old Testament, that of the Son in the New, continued in the words and writings of the Holy Fathers. The coming age of the Spirit will not need books, but simply have to walk directly in the Truth of grace. Christ and the Church are losing their absolute significance. Time has not come to fulfillment with the manifestation of the Christ, merely a new age begins, and progresses on similar lines to the last. The third age which is coming will bring completion to the whole history. It is the joyous last days, the great Easter festival which is to free the world from all troubles and bring blessed peace. There will be a Dux Novus, a new leader, a universal Pope of the New Jerusalem, who will renew the Christian religion and establish complete well-being on earth. Perfectia, Contemplatio, Libertas, and Spiritus are the four thoughts by which his visions are conditioned. The sense of this whole historical process is perfecting, a continuous development from stage to stage, until finally it debouches into the state of general perfection. Man as Homo spiritualis will slough off the bad qualities of the preceding epochs and be a new man. A powerful dynamic for the future and a mighty material too. Worldly optimism lie in Joachim's prophecies, which mobilize the whole chiliastic heritage of the West and bring it into a system which to this day has not lost its strength, but is still influencing the depths of the Western soul. With the concept of rebirth and renewal, the prevailing apocalyptic pessimism which could appeal only for conversion and repentance was turned into joyful expectation. At touch of the wand uprise all those concepts of the Vulgate such as Renasci regeneratio, nova vita, renovari and reformari, beget regeneration, new life, be renewed and reformed, as living ideas viable for the future, and as real forces taking their historically creative way through the reality of the West. Their immediate result was to sharpen the existing political tendencies, as utopianism tends to do. The fight between emperor and pope was interpreted in futurist terms. The imperial party of the Ghibellines saw in the emperor the awaited Dux Novus. Guelph party saw him in the pope. The intellectual unrest of the time, which broke into expression in the Franciscans and in the movements of the Amalricans, the Bigards, the Fraticelli, and brothers and sisters of the emancipated spirit, made use of Joachim's ideas, which fertilized religious, social and anarchist revolutionary tendencies, which were also influenced by the Hussite, the Minorites, and the Anabaptists, as was clearly shown in the works of Dante and in the person of Cola di Rienzo. No inclusive history of all these phenomena on the brink of the modern era has yet been written. Until now, bourgeois history has concentrated on the Italian Renaissance, which was the turning point of ideas, with religious expectation directed upon a better and more beautiful future. The phenomenon of history began to be a substitute religion, and the idea of progress finally included the whole of society. Though it took half a millennium before it was set in action on a broad front and embraced the masses, it did so in the French Declaration of the 18th century, found its completion in the enthusiasm of the 19th century, and broke down in the West in the early part of the 20th. The connection between the chiliasm of the 13th century and the social optimism of the 18th suggests that revelation and vision at the beginning of an historical epoch may prophetically see the future spread out, whereas consciousness of the inner forces at work comes only at the end, or, as Hegel expresses it, Minerva's owl only begins its flight in the gloaming. The passage of immediate experience to clear perception, in the course of a great historical culture, is not only enormously impeded by the new experience coming up against fierce resistance from the old cultural forms, but is further slowed down by the mass social forces which participate in it. The social forces are grasped one after the other by the new experience and reconstructed, and each of them endeavors to give its own representative form of perception, until perception is so ground and polished that it is easily accepted and understood by the masses. And finally, the inner workings of such a large historical process, which always begins and ends from below, become transparent. For it is the lowest social strata which is most strongly moved and captivated by the immediate prophetical visions of the Joachim of flora. All the great popular movements of the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries are chiliastically excited, and are as it were obsessed by the elements which have torn free their historical origins and come up to the surface. This living heritage, once again present in immediate experience, goes its way from below into the upper strata, where it is sufficiently worked upon by logical thought to find conscious form, and thus pass from experience to perception, and is then simplified enough for the lower strata to be able to grasp it and accept it. History is therefore that path from immediate mythical experience to conscious perception, from the myth to the idea, which is bound up with time. It is the process of living through experience and on to perception or recognition which goes on simultaneously in both internal and external worlds of an individual man, of a people and of a complete culture. The reason why history as the dynamic force of material optimism grew conscious so late is this: in the supreme area of pure thought, where an individual finds himself alone in his intellectual freedom, history as a collective force loses its time-bound specific gravity and decreased speed. Centuries are contracted to years on the soil of one individual existence. The hybrid hierarchical thought of the Middle Ages had long since risen in the course of its speculations to a height at which God might be sought, and it was so convinced of its own power that it believed itself able to demonstrate and define God's existence and nature. God, that is to say, had become an object of human consciousness, and at so great a height of speculation it needed but the tiniest screw to thought to prove that God does not exist. It was when thought had reached this height of certainty that the universal perceptions of a mathematically based science reduced the divine existence to a mere hypothesis, thereby laying the foundation for the autonomy of human consciousness. Absolute rationalism had no other basis for its assurance that it was capable of creating the world immediately out of itself, and was not dependent on history. The great metaphysicians of the 17th century, from Bacon to Leibniz, are still at the top of the vertical line, backed up by natural science, but with pale rudiments of religion as an emergency guarantee, ready to create out of themselves the new absolute image, which found its form in a system or a utopia. Their material and worldly optimism still bore the imprint of the hierarchy in which they occupied the upper heights. Their self-consciousness was so strongly marked that it looked dictatorial from top to bottom, but they themselves were unhistoric. They created all those concepts from the kingdom of man and Bacon's dictum that knowledge is power, through Descartes' autonomy of reason to Leibniz's theory of perfectibility, which were to attain immediate importance only. The middle and end of the 17th century brought the great setback in Europe, which ended in weariness and reaction. The movement from below had gone to the upper steps of the ramp of the hierarchy, and become imprisoned in the shells of authority created by the Church of the Counter-Reformation in the absolute state. In the assault from below, the Church had lost its predominant position, but along with the absolute state it built itself a new center of authority, which was to be assaulted by the next lowest social stratum, the bourgeoisie. And it was in the bourgeoisie that Chiliasm found its historical foundation and elevated history into an autonomous religious force. Already in Leibniz's philosophy the thought of a constant progressive development in the world had arisen, though he leant more on the old ideas of developmental unfolding, and there was no question yet of pure evolution. He bridged the way to the absolute progress optimism of the 18th century, which, conditioned by the gross material expectations of the French bourgeoisie, vaguely supported by Voltaire, and decidedly supported by Turgot and Condorcet in its modern superficiality, formed the revolutionary Chiliasm of the Third Estate. Experience of the Revolution, which consecrated a statue to the goddess of reason, but displayed human unreason before the world, smashed the absolutism of reason, and Sociology created the narrow bond between natural science and history, the two dominant forces of 19th century modernity. Chiliasm was then mobilizing the broad masses, to whom history delivered the dogma of progress, and natural science the wonders. As they stormed on towards the thousand years realm, the 19th century was a time of fulfillment, when all the elements conditioning modern Europe were united. The religious substance of eschatology, Messianism and Chiliasm, found in the concepts of progress and development a formulation acceptable and understood by all strata of society. The flat and unscientific intellectualism of the sociological and economic thought prevailing in the 19th century gave these chiliastic movements an ideological framework, without being quite clear about the old religious substance by which it was itself born. It unconsciously used words and images taken from concepts a thousand years old, and kept pointing to the material kingdom of glory to come. The chiliastic faith reached its apogee, whether in nationalistic, capitalistic, or socialistic guise, after crisis and catastrophe had darkened human consciousness, and obscure historical elements stored in the depths of man's soul were able to exert their force relatively free from control. Thus the elements of the Third Empire, the thousand years realm, come at the dux novus of rebirth and the new life which have dominated all modern revolutions. For they have all wanted to begin with the year one and start a new calendar, have at last been able to come right out in the daylight, and awaken a resounding echo in the souls of men. Chiliasm sent its substance up to the surface, came nakedly into view, and as it were in one last burst hurled itself into the realm of reality. For the substance of Chiliasm has been exhausted. The same old pictures are being thrown by man's expectation onto the screen of the future, but the strength of Chiliasm is beginning to fade. It has been unable to replace the Christian calendar, the year one, set up by sundry separate revolutions, has always sunk back again into the ancient reckonings of time. This inner exhaustion is shown, among other ways, by the goal of the promised glory being measured in brief terms, the leader having to content himself with 5 or 4 year plans because men's reserve of hopeful expectation is getting low. The crisis which has grown up into a catastrophe on the world historical scale has brought the end of modern times and the extinction of Chiliasm in the West. The case is different with the pessimistic apocalypse which dominated the Middle Ages. It was by no means extinguished afterwards, although it ceased to be representative. It developed parallel with Chiliasm, the latter thrusting upwards from below and flattening out the hierarchy. Pessimism, starting from the peak of the hierarchy, and becoming acclimatized at various levels as they were threatened, began to radiate downwards and outwards. Optimism links itself in each case with the lower strata and is given security by natural science, while pessimism links itself with the upper social strata and bases itself on religious and intellectual values, although it is continuously being assailed and weakened by natural science. This parallel movement becomes quite clear in the 18th and 19th centuries, until the increase in Chiliasm arising from natural science widened the opposition between them. Both then became more radical, so that finally future blessedness in this world and the realm beyond stand sharply opposed, and led to the rupture of the 20th century, which, through the crisis, is dividing West between revolution and religion. This form of opposition is not new. It was felt in the Italian Renaissance, whose wild and too materialistic impulses ended here darkness and despair. The humanism of the Renaissance certi broke away from the eschatology of Christian pessimism and laid emphasis on the new good times to come. But as things developed, there grew among the upper and more intelligent classes a sense of deception, and the original optimism began to change to a consciousness of decline. In Machiavelli, who takes up the old circuit theory of history, Optimism and pessimism break even in the scales, and are both as it were neutralized in rationalism. Humanistic thought depicted the Middle Ages in the dark colors of decline, retained by humanism to this day. Appended to the circuit theory, however, we already find consciousness breaking through with Vasari, to maintain itself even in an epoch of regression and decline, and it subsequently gained ground and was supported by men of letters and artists. But natural scientists and technicians were beginning to harvest the first fruits of the mathematics scientific method, and optimism seemed firmly based. Optimism continued in the great 17th century systems, in which the foundations of pure rationalism were laid. The pure reason born statistics of these systems coincided with state absolutism, which, as a successor to the Church, and in conjunction with the ecclesiastical and feudal forces, created a new center of authority. This was the era of the Baroque, which attempted to build itself a form out of the heterogeneous elements of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and was strained nearly to bursting by the two extremes. Baroque was the first attempt at a restoration, already bearing in it the germ of its own decline, and perfectly well aware of the fact. For it was highly sensitive and had a keen scent for the past, for decline, for decadence, and death. The upper strata perceived the collapse in values and the decline in taste. Natural science and rationalism, both fruits of the mathematical method, thrust themselves violently into the foreground. But the social strata to whom the heritage of the Middle Ages had fallen, and who found themselves as the next highest gradation of the hierarchy, perceived the emptiness of the intellectual artistic culture, and the slackening of religious and ethical energies, and interpreted them as signs of the decline of culture generally. This belief was illuminated by the collapse of the Roman Empire, of which people became conscious only after the Church had ceased to be regarded as a continuation of Rome, that is to say, after the historical theory of the four world monarchies had been replaced by the new scheme of humanism. It was then that the Roman Empire really vanished, and modern Europe's historic sense was faced with fact as a burden on its own culture. Every subsequent epoch has mirrored itself in the collapse of the Roman Empire, and each one has emphasized just those causes for the collapse which it believed it found in itself. Whereas the 17th century was occupied from Bacon to wallow with the question whether modern times constituted an advance or a regression in relation to antiquity, a discussion in which the concepts of progress and decadence obtained their characteristic imprint, towards the end of the 17th century. Bossuet's Handbook of History for the Dauphin dealt for the first time with Rome on a large scale. 50 years later Montesquieu published his considerations of the causes of the grandeur of the Romans and their decadence, through which the decline of Rome and the concept of decadence entered Europe's consciousness, and 10 years later, Rousseau published his first prize composition, the whole theme of which was the opposition between nature and culture. Its influence continued well into the 19th century. The Soissons Academy asked what the arts and sciences had contributed to an improvement in morals. Rousseau answered flatly that they had only led to the corruption and decadence of man's natural being. Through art and science and the luxuriousness of culture, man has become a spoiled animal, his simple national habits have been displaced. His hope is in leaving the field of culture and finding his way back to nature. With Rousseau, apocalyptic thought broke with enormous force over modern optimism. He found a day critique of culture which has been steadily waxing, and appeared in the 19th century on a broad front. The immediate effects of this critique were of a different kind. Rousseau smashed the hierarchical basis of the leading social forces, and destroyed what values they still possessed, by scourging them as corrupt and rotten. By so doing he gave to the next highest gradation, the third estate, the ideas and concepts which flared in the Revolution and carried the broad masses of the citizenry to power. The third estate experienced its renaissance in the Revolution. It contained in a vital and effective form the elements of natural science and rationalism, which had been popularized by the Enlightenment. The eruption of the third estate released the energies which streamed into the 19th century and made it the great era of progress. The racket of the 19th century drowned the voices expressing dark forebodings of decline and destruction, but now that we are some distance removed from the period, we see with astonishment that there were no thinkers of any importance who were not tormented by dark apprehensions of collapse and impending catastrophe. While chiliasm filled the broad masses of the third and fourth estates, pessimism, conditioned by the intellect and radiating downwards, grew stronger and stronger, and towards the close of the century assumed prophetic form. Once again, however, it was contradicted by natural science, expanding the scope of its technical wonders, and thus killing all objection. Apocalyptic eschatology therefore grows in the dark, it becomes a sort of underground movement, and individual thinkers only express their apprehensions hesitantly as writers or in their professional capacity, they express them more readily in conversation, or entrust them to the discretion of letters and the secrecy of the diary, whispering them to each other, as it were softly and constrainedly. People will be cleverer and more penetrating, says Goethe, but not better, not happier, not more energetic. I see the time coming when God has no more pleasure in them but has to smash everything up to make a new creation. And now we look ahead and see, unless God gives us a miracle, destruction facing us, wrote Niebuhr in 1830, as the world of Rome experienced it in the middle of the third century of our era. We see the destruction of wealth, freedom, and of education and science. Rinke amplified him 10 years later. In earlier days great convictions were general, and on the ground of them people went on with their efforts. Nowadays, everything is so to speak pronunciamenta and slogan, and that's an end of it. Nothing is pushed through to an end. Everything fades out. Anyone who does get on with it is speaking with the voice of a Pectin party and finds in it all his support. One fine day the frightful capitalism from above and the covetous urge from below will meet like two express trains on a single track, and then what a smash there'll be, says Burckhardt. It has long been perfectly clear to me that the world is being made to choose between complete democracy and absolute and utterly unjustified despotism, whereof the latter can no longer be exercised by reigning dynasties, for these have become too soft, but by military commandants posing as republicans. Nietzsche becomes an apocalyptic voice of decadence. What has occupied me the most deeply is in fact the problem of decadence, he said of himself. Our whole European culture has for a long time been moving with a torturing tension, which increases from decade to decade, and must end in a catastrophe. What I am telling you is the history of the next 2 centuries. I am describing what is going to happen, and what can only happen in one form, the emergence of nihilism. Spengler expands this line. Eschatological pessimism was at its strongest at the beginning of the 19th century, when it was aroused by the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. It became a general movement with the decadent voices of the end of century, over which the shadow of coming catastrophe was already lying. In both cases, as in the 18th century, it originated in France. It was introduced by a French Romanticism and the traditionalism of Chateaubriand, de Maistre, de Bonald, and the youthful Lamennais. It influenced German Romanticism and created the intellectual basis for the attempted restoration of the Holy Alliance, but, like the latter, was dispersed by forces from below. Sociology and economics, which were linked with history and natural science, strengthened materialism and assisted positivism. The decadence of the end of century also comes from France, where it began to make its voice heard by the middle of the century. After the War of 1870 it became open and insistent. But after Rousseau turned eschatological pessimism into a critique of culture, it occupied the leading spirits in all European countries, and reached its peak in the great Russian historic philosophical and literary works, with their frank renunciation of Western values. Thus Chiliasm was strengthened by the wonders of technique and encouraged by the political promises of nationalism, parliamentarism, capitalism, and socialism, but pessimism was meanwhile developing on the heights of the European spirit, foreseeing the problems which were to become grim reality in the 20th century. While the Western spirit saw the catastrophe coming, however, and was clear as to some of the causes, it no longer had the strength to employ its knowledge by showing how catastrophe might be avoided. Each thinker, like other prophets, including the Jewish, began by saying I foresee or I foretell, but in every other period prediction was the base from which the prophet began his essential task of stirring the soul to awareness, leading on to conversion, repentance, and atonement. European rationalism lacked this power. One need only compare Burckhardt, Nietzsche, and Spengler with the Old Testament prophets to realize the loss. The essential change can only come from within mankind, said Burckhardt. And again, things will only be changed through the actions of ascetics. That is saying a good deal, and Burckhardt is today regarded as being a religious person. But what does it really amount to? And even these sayings are not characteristic of Burckhardt's work, but are taken at random from letters not intended for publication. Like the chiliastically excited masses, the higher European spirit marched into catastrophe, the sole difference being its awareness of where it was going. It did so in the belief that man stood under the compulsion of immutable laws into which consciousness could indeed contrive some insight, but in which it could not intervene. In foreseeing catastrophe, pessimistic eschatology rose to the surface and emerged nakedly, like Chiliasm, in one last mighty outburst. It also hurled itself into the realm of reality and exhausted itself. Chiliastic optimism and apocalyptic pessimism, both related to the future in this world, and both in their time having activated our modern epoch, have broken down. That shows itself most clearly in the collapse of history, a main pillar of the modern world image. The lineal conception of history has gone, and today we have a debris of recorded facts from which individual research picks out this bit or that, to set it in some new light, but with no idea of an edifice into which the bits can be fitted. History has no longer the strength to bear man, nor man the strength in himself to form history. Confirmation of this is to be found in the cyclical theory of history, linked with Polybius, Machiavelli, and Vico, and revived by Spengler in a hint form, and gaining ground ever since. It is probable that Western man, unable to endure the sudden collapse of eschatology or to achieve the inner transformation it demands, will initiate a series of chiliastic revivals. This is the more likely because it is only in Europe that eschatology has collapsed. Elsewhere it is still thriving, conditioning for example the dynamics of Russia and America, which in their turn reflect power back to the West. Such attempts will, however, be but the afterpangs of a great process which has come to its end, and cannot liberate new movements. Christianity is likely to support the attempted revival of eschatology. But although eschatology can be used as a basis for theological dialectic, the dialectic lacks alluring force and vitalizing spark. Man finds no renewal in it, nor does it release new enthusiasm. The important matter for today: the extinction of eschatology creates vast problems, casting Western man back to the beginnings of his history. To be deprived of history is bound to change his character, for it robs him of essential forces which have stamped his type and made him what the rest of the world recognized as a Westerner. The end of eschatology means the end of expectation directed towards the future. Man thus stands before an absolute void. Such is the position of nihilism, which throughout the West has ceased to be a mere philosophic pose and has become a reality of the streets and marketplaces. It is an attitude of desperation. All theologies, isms, and programs which not long ago possessed messianic force hang like cobwebs over the rubble and ruins of the age. Being deprived of history, however, does not mean having nothing to look forward to. It means that expectation, formerly directed to the future that is far off and ahead, is beginning to move back into the vertical and to be directed upwards. Vertical man also has something to look for and live for, but he waits for an eruption from above, striving to escape from the void of this material world and the despairing conspect of nothingness. He is waiting for all the things he lacks today, a new saner experience and the fullness of a new inner living, and thus for a new revelation to tell him, as the world he has himself built no longer can, who he is and to what end he is alive. If this transformation in the depths of Western man is associated with external manifestations which lead us to assume a decline and fall of the West, the assumption is itself an outcome of pessimistic eschatology, and does not correspond to the truth. For in truth, Western man is starting a new epoch in the history of mankind by beginning a search for inner transformation, renewal, rebirth. That is the only essential question before mankind, and it will condition the next centuries. All else is unimportant. This brief excursion seemed necessary because Western man, puffed up by modernity, tends to see in the end of the eschatology the end of his continent and of his existence. Deprived of eschatology, history collapsed, and all attempts to re-erect by new structures and historic philosophical devices are doomed to failure, since the inner substance of the history has run dry. One can, of course, take up anew the old cyclical theory and try it out as basis for a new historical philosophy. One can make a high mystery of fitting the old line image into the circuit, making man's path like a circular treadmill which somehow leads upwards. Last conception is, indeed, being discussed a good deal just now. It does not alter the fact that history has been deprived of its dynamics. But it is upon the connection between history and natural science that the modern world image has been built up. Can natural science provide this ground alone, or is it equally involved in the crisis?